The old international order is breaking apart, but what is going to take its place? And how would we rate Donald Trump's foreign policy so far in his second term?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Those are the questions we're going to take up today on this special edition of Potomac Watch. My guest is Walter Russell Mead. He is the Global View columnist for the Wall Street Journal, a weekly columnist. He's also a professor at the University of Florida's Hamilton Center, a scholar at the Hudson Institute, and a distinguished historian of American foreign policy, most recently in his book, The Ark of a Covenant, on the history of relations between the United States and Israel. Walter, good to have you here.
It's great to see you, Paul.
Thanks for coming in. So let's talk about, this is a theme you've been developing for some time, the changing nature of global politics. And of course, it's arguably the biggest story anywhere, even if domestic issues dominate the daily press. For me, it's, I think, the biggest issue right now. First, why don't you define for our listeners, how would you define the old world order that is breaking up?
Yeah. After the shocks of First World War I, then the Depression, then World War II, and then almost immediately afterwards, a kind of Soviet bid to dominate Europe and the world, Americans were pretty convinced that we had to get much more engaged in the world to try to prevent more of this kind of thing happening, especially obviously with the use of nuclear weapons at the end of World War II. And so they thought long and hard about why do we keep having these wars, and what does America need to do? And they came up with sort of several different tracks that we more or less imposed on the rest of the world with some help from our allies. But in the early 1950s, late 40s, our allies themselves were too flattened by the war to be a whole lot of help. So we pushed for democratic governments in Europe and in Japan. We actually forced democratization on Germany and Japan, the part of Germany that was under Western Allied control. Obviously, East Germany went its own way with the Soviets. We also thought that prosperity was a key to preventing war. And one of the ways to do that was to begin to reduce the tariffs and barriers for international trade, originally to allow the Germans, Japanese, and other Europeans to recover from the war. And also American exporters realized that we couldn't export unless other people had the money to pay. And that meant they would have to sell some stuff to us. So we moved from an era of protectionism in American foreign policy to one of free trade. We also decided that we would need strong alliances and strong international institutions to, on the one hand, deter aggression, but on the other, to try to find alternatives to war and conflict for countries to manage their international relations. Well, after the end of the Cold War, we doubled down. And we tried to build we tried to strengthen that world order. And that more or less is what the Americans have been doing for 80 years.
You can argue, Walter, and I would, that was a spectacular success. Obviously, it brought in much more of the world into prosperity. We raised literally billions, helped to raise billions of people out of poverty. The alliance system we built in Europe won the Cold War. But that has faded, obviously. The end of history, as you remember, was supposed to happen at the end of the Cold War. The U.S., I would argue, took that a little too seriously and decided we were not going to spend a lot of money on defense, and among other decisions. But now you think you've written that that old order is breaking up. And I guess before we get to the question of what takes its place, let's talk about who killed it. Is it the adversaries who are marshaling against us in a much more aggressive way? China, Russia, Iran, and so on, or is it internal failings of the West and the United States losing their confidence and making policy mistakes?
Well, at the very bottom of all of this is just the truth that nothing lasts forever. And that as the world economy changes and as countries like India and China emerge and become superpowers or potential superpowers, the way the world works changes, and institutions and ideas need to reflect that. So, just because you get something right in 1947 doesn't mean that in 2057, that's all you need to know. And so I think part of the problem is just simply that adjustment and reform always needed to be much more of our thinking, as opposed to, oh, thank goodness we've settled all that. Now let's get on with stuff that's more fun, like purely domestic politics. So that's underlying a lot of this. But beyond that, I do think this end of history disease, and that's what it was, this kind of infatuation with our success was profoundly destructive. On the one hand, as you say, it absolutely ended any sense of, okay, we have to defend. There was never any sense, okay, the Wicked Witch is dead and there will be no more Wicked Witches. The whole Wicked Witch thing is over forever. Right. That, unfortunately, is not how human nature works, and it's not how history works. And new candidates for the throne of the Wicked Witch are clearly appearing on our doorstep. So there was that. But there was also, I think, an overconfidence in how easy it was to do things. So, okay, hey, democracy promotion worked in Germany and Japan. Well, you're a racist if you don't think it will also work in Iraq and Egypt. There was this idea that we could just almost magically transform societies. And so at the same time we were cutting back on the defense of the world order, we were reframing the goals of world order in a much more ambitious way. So if we're not having gender positive economic development in the Congo, if we're not protecting gay rights in Brunei, okay, we're not doing our job for the world order. So the world order in reality was becoming simultaneously more fragile and more ambitious. That is a terrible, terrible direction to go in. And I think, since 1990, that's not a bad description of the way the West overall has been conducting its business. So you can't expect to be really stupid for a really long time and not pay a price at some point.
On your democracy point, I certainly you jumped from Japan and Germany to Egypt and Iraq, and I take both of those points. But in between, there was some success in the 1980s with the democratization of South Korea, Taiwan,
Absolutely.
Philippines, some others. I was on the ground in Asia covering those countries at the time. And I do think that the success of that era, and remember, democracy also was spreading in that period in South America. I think that gave us more, that contributed to our overconfidence in what we could do in the Middle East and elsewhere. Just that caveat. So here we are, and the institutions of that old order are frayed dramatically, and I would add the will of the West to actually meet some of these challenges is very much in question. And if you look at Europe, for example, Western Europe, they simply seem incapable of making a choice between kind of domestic contentment of the welfare state and the need to spend money to actually defend yourself against adversaries. And here in the U.S., there is, and I want you to talk about this in particular. There's been not necessarily an isolationism all of the 1930s, but certainly a fatigue, a sense of we have borne the burden for so long. Now other people need to pick that up. And I don't see a lot of candidates for that without U.S. leadership. Kind of respond to that.
Well, on your point about the caveat, by the way, I would agree that the success in East Asia was very important. Again, some very specific historical factors. I would never want to say that the world order on its own terms was a failure. It kept peace for 2 generations in terms of no great power major wars, and it did provide for the relatively peaceful decolonization of the European empires and for the productive integration of billions of people in the world economy in ways that were unimaginable before. So it's a tragedy that we failed to maintain it. It's partly a tragedy because it was such a good thing at its, when it was working. But so where are we now? The question of will, I think, goes a lot deeper than just the question of, am I going to vote for a pension increase or am I going to vote for a defense budget increase? It's also, do I understand that the young people in my country need to be brought up with the idea that their country is worth dying for and fighting for and dying for? Because the Germans may not be willing to pay for a lot for defense, but they're more willing to spend money for defense than they are to fight wars. And I think that's actually true in the United States, even, that the idea that we would, and this is behind some of that neo-isolationist thinking or whatever we want to call it. There's not a lot of hunger. Certainly you won't find what happened in, say, Ivy League grads in World War I and World War II were dropping out of school in droves to enlist. That's not what would happen in those circumstances today. We have some serious kind of cultural, political problems, but at the same time, we have enemies. And this is very important to understand. We have a country like China, which, much to everyone's surprise, turned out to be communist after all, where the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party believes that the maintenance of its own power is essential to China's rise and even unity, and also that thanks to that the advances in technology will allow them to control their society more fully than, say, the old Soviet or Maoist leaders ever could, but also allow them to make a planned economy really triumph. And so they're back with this idea that a kind of Marxist technological totalitarian regime is the best thing for China and will inevitably lead China to global domination. We as a society are nowhere close to realizing the sort of gravity of this challenge or the complexity, the number of levels we're going to have to deal with it on. And at the same time, we see that connected to China and in some ways piggybacking on China, countries like Russia and Iran have also mounted, the equivalent of full-scale offensives against the geopolitical balance of power and the world order that came to be after 1945. Now, thankfully for us all, as German Chancellor Merz said, Israel did everyone's dirty work in knocking Iran back. But we still face the Russia challenge. We have not developed an effective policy for dealing with the Russian attack on Ukraine or other bad actions that Russia is taking, ranging from Africa to all over the Central Asia and beyond. So the challenge geopolitically and globally is far greater than most public opinion in the West, including the US, yet understands. And we are very far from developing an effective set of strategies to combat this set of challenges.
That's certainly a bracing analysis of where we are. Now, I would argue that one of the reasons Donald Trump won was, in the back of people's minds, was that the world was disordered and getting more dangerous, and that Donald Trump's strength, ill-defined in the minds of most Americans, no doubt, but would be preferable to Joe Biden, the old liberal internationalist who saw the world changing underneath his feet and really didn't know how to adapt. Now, Donald Trump comes in with a set of his own ideas of how to confront this world. How well do you think he's doing so far in meeting this challenge? I guess, and I'll just ask you a leading part of this question, which is, I would say, against Iran, doing well. Against Russia, not so well. Against China, incomplete, but some worrying signs. Go ahead.
Yeah, look, he has a sense that the status quo wasn't working, and he's looking to make some changes. It's always hard, I think, trying to analyze President Trump's approach, because he doesn't go through what most policy wonks would consider a normal policy process, where you set up, you have bullet points, you have arguments at the National Security Council, and this very disciplined interagency refining options that get to that's not how Donald Trump works. He has a kind of inner intuition about what he thinks is right, how he thinks you can win, how to bargain effectively with foreign leaders, and of course, how to manage his political coalition at home. So he is always juggling these factors inside his mind in a way that's often very, very difficult for those of us who work differently to try to understand. But as far as I can tell, what we see is this, that Israel is an example of the kind of ally that Donald Trump really likes. That is, Israel is more afraid of Iran and of terrorism in the Middle East than the U.S. is. And so Israel is always eager to do more, and the U.S. job is to sort of rein back the enthusiasm of its ally, right? And so Israel will take risks. Israel will pay. Israel, yes, fine, we help them, but they're in the lead doing all the, doing the dirty work. And if there's dirty work that has to be done, Bibi will do the dirty work. Okay, that is so different from the approach of the Europeans, and even to a certain degree to our Asian allies, where the European idea of the alliance, at least until Trump came along, was we will sit back and do nothing while you take responsibility for defending us, and we will lecture you on your moral failings. And we will also spend money that we would otherwise have spent on defense onto all kinds of lovely domestic priorities. And we will then lecture you about your failure to build welfare states that are as lavish as ours. That is the sort of European model. But not only that, because your security shield makes us safe, we are going to engage in all the commercial deals we possibly can with Russia, right? Without any regard for the downstream consequences of any of those decisions. So an alliance that ostensibly is meant to protect Europeans from Russia is actually the United States writing blank checks for Europe to betray the alliance, both by not doing its part in upholding it, but also in making deals with the adversary against whom the alliance is designed. Trump wants to flip that. He thinks, look, if there is a Russian threat, it's a bigger threat to Germany than it is to the United States. So let Germany be the one that's spending a lot of money, and America being the one that feels it can make commercial deals with Russia. Let the Europeans be begging the United States not to make big deals with Russia over their heads while taking the burden of defense. And then let us be restraining European anti-Russian sentiment in the interests of broader peace and concord. And he wants something similar in Asia, where again, Japan's a lot closer to China than the United States is. Taiwan is a lot closer to China than the United States is. Let those countries be the one. Let Japan's and Taiwan's defense spending should be a higher percentage of GDP than America's. But again, the problem would be that when you look at why these countries have valued the alliance in the past, part of it was that the access to the American market under our post-World War II concepts of free trade as they developed was one of the most attractive things about the American alliance to our Asian partners. So Trump is, as to our European. So Trump is both by introducing uncertainty and protectionism and tariffs into trade is reducing the enthusiasm or the constituencies that are enthusiastically pro-American in these countries, but also he wants to raise the price of the American security guarantees. How this will work out, it's hard to say. In Europe, for now, what they seem to do is they're at least pretending to comply in the hope of getting him to do something on Ukraine in particular. The Asians are, I think at this moment, stunned and confused and still meditating what to do. The deportation of a large group of Hyundai employees to South Korea has probably not helped the political climate in Seoul.
I think that is an understatement. The scenes of these Koreans in shackles and handcuffs really, I think, has had some done real harm to the American image in South Korea. We'll see how that plays out. I guess, so what you're saying is work in progress. Trump has, obviously, after only 8 months, he faces some big choices, clearly here. Obviously, what to do ultimately in Ukraine. Putin wasn't charmed enough by his summit in Alaska. And what will Trump do about it? Will he actually decide to punish Putin with additional sanctions and confiscations of assets and things? We don't know. Then there's also Trump's desire, I think, to get a modus vivendi, some kind of a deal with China. And we have to see where he comes out on that. But you can see him making accommodations to China that suggest he wants to reach some kind of modus vivendi that is short of confrontation. And I think remains to be seen what the contours of that deal will be like.
That's right. And, there's a saying attributed probably wrongly to Teddy Roosevelt that diplomacy is the art of saying nice doggy while you feel around behind you for a stick. And, if Trump's approach to China is based on that, on a sense that the United States needs a little bit of time to kind of get our act together and so on, well, maybe an accommodation of some kind could make sense for both parties. But I think only if what we then saw was a serious attempt to use that period of accommodation to prepare ourselves. And that, building up public opinion, renewing our defenses, reducing our dependence on Chinese inputs in strategic industries, all of those kinds of things. So again, what Trump has done so far is he has further shaken and destabilized a tottering world system. One can visualize potentially positive outcomes to things that are happening, but it's an immensely complex undertaking to do what he does. And some of the things he does, I think particularly on trade, have greater costs than maybe some in the administration have factored in. So we live in interesting times, and whatever history's verdict on President Trump will be, clearly Donald Trump is one of the most interesting presidents in the history of the United States.
You mean that in the Chinese sense of the Chinese curse sense of interesting, I think? May you live in interesting times.
Right. Although I have to say, for a columnist, it's not really the worst fate on earth to live at a time when everybody is very curious about international relations and wants and is concerned about them. So, just speaking personally, Donald Trump is good for business, just on a personal basis. But you wonder where it all leads.
Yeah, well, I take that point, and I could contrast it with my columnist days in the 1990s when if I wrote about the war in the Balkans or trouble in Kosovo, it sank like a stone without a lot of readers. But that's not the case today. Well, look, we'll leave it there, Walter. I appreciate your being on, and we're here to all of our listeners. Thank you for listening. We are here every day on Potomac Watch talking about current events, and every once in a while we have somebody like Walter on to explain how the world works. So thank you all for listening. Hope to have you with us tomorrow.